Now, in an age where new video games regularly cost as much as 70 quid, it's little surprise that publishers pack them with reams of filler in an attempt to justify that rather steep asking price. And even when video games are great, they can sometimes overstep into territory that basically sees your time as their time and they want more. So let's have a chat about them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 amazing, outstanding, fantabulous games that are too damn long. Number 10, Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth. The latest entry into the Like a Dragon, or Yakuza franchise, is in many respects the epitome of everything that it's been building towards all these years. A dizzyingly entertaining action RPG that is by turns thrilling, hilarious, and heartfelt. Infinite Wealth successfully passes the torch to the new series protagonist Ichiban, while lending additional emotional dimensions to the former lead Kiryu. But the game's many great achievements also bristle up against its rather outrageous length. It's not just the 50-hour critical path that's the issue here, but the pacing as well. Infinite Wealth gets off to one of the slowest starts in the entire series, and it's a surprising number of hours before Ichiban even ends up in the new central location of Hawaii. Though the story is packed with all the cartoonish insanity that fans of the series expect, it definitely also over-eggs the pudding a little by the end. The final few chapters in particularly prove hugely patience-testing in the sheer number of enemies that they throw at you, especially as many of these encounters are nothing more than never-ending hordes of general mobs. The fine devs over there probably don't want to hear it, but where Like a Dragon is concerned, a less is more approach would actually benefit future entries. Number 9, Crash Bandicoot 4, It's About Time. Now, it's nothing short of a miracle that the belated fourth mainline Crash Bandicoot game turned out as well as it did, unexpectedly returning to the brutal difficulty of the original title while hurling a ton of new inventive gameplay mechanics into the mix. But Crash 4 is ultimately also a little too much of a good thing. If the original trilogy of Crash games could be comfortably beaten in an afternoon each, Crash 4 can take upwards of 10 hours to get through, and that's in large part because so many of the levels are so much longer than they need to be. The levels from the first 3 games were bite-sized chunks lasting mere minutes apiece, but most of Crash 4's levels are considerably longer, lasting as much as 15 or so minutes. This proves especially punishing for completionists trying to smash every box in the game, but even if you're just sprinting to the finish line, the expanded length cuts down on Crash 4's pick-up and play appeal compared to its predecessors. Number 8, God of War Ragnarok. So God of War Ragnarok is a mostly electrifying follow-up to 2018's spirited reimagining of the blockbuster Sony IP, bolstered by its jaw-dropping visuals, tight combat, compelling story, and outstanding character work. It's also a classic example of a sequel to a beloved game which needlessly expanded the playtime in the pursuit of being a bigger, better successor. But as thrilling and as brilliantly crafted as Ragnarok is, this is also a game that ends up outstaying its welcome by at least a few hours. 2018's game could be beaten pretty comfortably in around 15 hours. But Ragnarok ends up being around 20, with several divergent chapters very obviously just being there to just pad out the length. By far the most egregious offender is the infamous trip to Ironwood, but there are numerous other sections that feel like glorified side content that has been awkwardly shoehorned into the main campaign. In large part due to its regular switching up of playable characters, Ragnarok lacks the taut, considered pacing of its predecessor, in turn putting a small but rather notable dent in its overall greatness. Number 7, Marvel's Midnight Suns. Marvel's Midnight Suns is a maddeningly underappreciated game that came and went without much of a peep in late 2022, largely due to it releasing during a pretty stacked period. Even for those who immediately turned their nose up at card-based games though, Midnight Suns is a bloody riot. A supremely fun and addictive superhero romp that delivers perfectly on the promise of XCOM but with Marvel gameplay. But developer Firaxis Games also blew far past that sweet spot where the content was concerned. You see, the core experience is woefully bloated out with repetitive missions and tiresome social mini-games where you're forced to hang out with your fellow heroes, enough that a brilliant 15-hour game is padded to a flabby and less satisfying 30 hours or so. Perhaps more than any other game on this list, it's painfully obvious where cuts could be made. So much of the mandatory content could have been optional fare instead, in turn giving players the freedom to dictate how long they spend with the game before they want to reach the end. Number 6, It Takes Two. It Takes Two is the most recent co-op adventure game from Hazelight Studios and eccentric director Joseph Fares, the mind behind previous co-op titles Brothers, A Tale of Two Sons, and A Way Out. Now, It Takes Two is a laudably ambitious expansion of Hazelight's basic gameplay framework, pairing players as a fraught married couple who are forced to team up after being inadvertently turned into miniature dolls by their distraught daughter. There's so much joy to be had throughout this game, which continually switches up the varied teamwork mechanics while immersing players in a bevy of gorgeous locales. locales. But given that the prior games were bite-sized affairs, it was reasonable to assume that It Takes Two would similarly clock in at just a few short hours. After all, for a game clearly designed to have gamers playing with their non-gamer partners, keeping the playtime to a single-digit realm definitely made sense. Yet, if you're teaming up with a competent co-op partner and saw through levels at a confident pace, you'll struggle to actually get through this in less than 10 hours. It's a textbook example of a creative and well-executed game that grossly overstays its welcome, enough that anyone planning to play it with a non-gamer partner or significant other might struggle to convince them to saddle up for such a long ride. This should have been 6 to 8 hours at the absolute most. Number 5. Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. In the gaming world, Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots is basically the peak of auteur self-indulgence, a game so verbose in spite of itself that it basically becomes self-parody. But it also happens to be a fantastic experience, a loony, peerlessly ambitious piece of storytelling bolstered by Hideo Kojima's drum-tight action gameplay, as well as a bevy of unforgettable boss fights and one hell of an emotional ending. But with Metal Gear Solid 4, Konami also took all of the shackles off of Kojima and let him freely get high off his own supply. As such, the reams of exposition have never felt more breathless, nor the absurdly lengthy cutscenes more abusively overdone. The game's script desperately needed some editing, and its infamous Europe-set third act grinds the pacing to an absolute standstill. Guns of the Patriots is a mostly magnificent testament to what can happen when great artists are just allowed to cook, but if it lost just a few hours, well, it would be even better. Number 4. Luigi's Mansion 3. For the most part, Luigi's Mansion 3 is a rare belated video game sequel that fully delivers on the promises of its predecessors, with its clever level design, memorable bosses, and cracking visuals. However, it also commits the cardinal sin of not knowing when to call it a day. The puzzle adventure game clocks in at a fairly beefy 15-ish hours, and by the time it's all over, you'll likely have started to develop Luigi's Mansion fatigue, especially after having played through a few laborious repetitive sections which should have clearly been left on the cutting room floor. Throughout, it's extremely obvious when Nintendo is serving up their most creative top-shelf content and when they're just spinning their wheels in a needless effort to artificially inflate the game's length. Chop a few hours out of the middle of this thing and you've got one of the Switch's best first-party games ever. As it stands though, the boring, obvious bloat makes it tough to consider a second playthrough. Number 3. Akami. Now, on one hand, Akami is a gorgeous, unique, and thoroughly entertaining action-adventure game you absolutely owe it to yourself to play. On the other, it's one of the most excessively drawn-out video games of all time. It's no exaggeration to say that Akami feels like it's about to wrap up at least twice before it actually does. After the first battle with 8-headed dragon Orochi, it seems like the game is going to roll credits inside of a reasonable 8 to 10 hours. But alas, this is just the end of the first act. Indeed, Akami goes on for another 20-ish hours, and even after you fight Orochi again, you then have to take on the game's real big bad, Yami. Basically, Clover Studio crammed 3 games worth of content into a single title, and while we shouldn't look a gift horse in the mouth, there's also something to be said for leaving players wanting more. Instead, Akami is likely to leave you burned out and very, very glad that it's finally over by the end. Number 2. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. In many respects, Final Fantasy VII Rebirth is a masterful piece of work, a loving recreation/reimagining of the beloved RPG's middle portion that ranks amongst the strongest installments in the entire franchise. But my god, it's also a colossal endurance trial of a game. Basically, everything you do in Rebirth takes considerably longer than it needs to. Even something as simple as restoring your HP and MP at a bench takes a baffling 15 or so seconds when it should be near instant. But far more egregiously, even if you stick to the story's critical path, it's an insanely padded experience, packed to the gills with repetitive dungeons, snooze-inducing busy work tasks, and an overabundance of mini-games. By the time that you've made it through the never-ending final dungeon and beaten the game, Rebirth is as much exhausting as it is enthralling. If predecessor Final Fantasy VII Remake felt like a 20-hour game stretched out to 30, Rebirth feels like a 30-hour game elongated to 50 or more. Why Square Enix is so aggressively committed to overstuffing an already content-rich game is totally baffling, but it ultimately undermines what is otherwise an extremely impressive title. And number 1, The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword. The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword is another reliably majestic entry into the franchise, with its visuals, music, dungeons, and story generally evoking all the wonder that fans have come to expect from the series. But it's also a masterful 15-hour game that is encased within a 30-hour slog. From the game's never-ending hand-holding to the relentless interactions with Fee-Fi-Fo-Go Fuck Yourself and overabundance of fetch quests and backtracking, Skyward Sword unfolds at a glacial pace. Even some of its more memorable puzzles and dungeons seem determined to do anything but just unfold at a consistent clip. Now, the highs are high enough that most Zelda fans will likely push through to the end, but the franchise has never felt quite so insistent on saddling the A+ material with a ton of generic filler. Thankfully, Nintendo clearly heard fan complaints loud and clear, because as while follow-up Breath of the Wild was a gigantic game by comparison, most all of its content felt unique and meaningful. And there we go, my friends. Those were 10 amazing video games that are too damn long. I hope you enjoyed that, and let me know what you thought about it down in the comments section below. As always, I've been Jules. You can go follow me over on the social medias where I'm at RetroJ, but the O is a 0, or you can swing by the Future Game Show, or FGS, where I'm pretty much doing all of my daily gaming content going forward. Big love to you all. Hope you're treating yourself well, and remember to look after yourself, all right? Because you're a massive ledge. As always, I've been Jules. You have been awesome. Never forget that. I'll speak to you soon. Bye.